It was the single most insulting thing an Allied officer could say to the most powerful military on Earth. In late 1966, a brigadier from a country with fewer soldiers than America had Marines stood in a briefing room at Bien Hoa and told a United States general to his face that he didn't want American troops anywhere near his area of operations. The general stared. His aides stopped writing. The room went so quiet, you could hear the ceiling fan cutting the humid air. The Australian brigadier was not finished. He explained, in the blunt language that Australians seemed incapable of softening, that American infantry replacements arriving in Phuoc Tuy Province would not raise his combat effectiveness. They would destroy it. He had watched them come off helicopters. He had observed their training. He had studied their tactics. And his professional assessment, delivered without apology or diplomatic courtesy, was this: "Don't send us your rejects. We'd rather fight undermanned than fight with men who don't know how to fight." He was not being arrogant. He was being honest, and the reason he could say it, the reason he had earned the authority to refuse the assistance of the most powerful military force in human history, begins with a decision made months earlier in Canberra that would change the course of the entire war in one small Vietnamese province. To understand the audacity of that moment, you need to understand what Australia was doing in Vietnam and why they were doing it differently from everyone else. In March 1966, the Australian government announced that it would create a single, relatively independent task force and deploy it to South Vietnam. This was not a casual decision. It was a calculated military and political move driven by the recognition that when the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been attached to the American 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa the previous year, the differences between Australian and American methods had become impossible to ignore. The Americans fought with massed firepower and helicopter mobility in massive search and destroy operations designed to grind down the enemy through sheer attrition. The Australians emphasized deliberate patrolling, village security, intelligence-driven ambushes, and the patient separation of guerrilla forces from the civilian population. Working under American command meant fighting the American way, and the Australians had concluded, after a year of watching the American way produce body counts without security, that they needed their own ground to prove their methods could work. The province they chose was Phuoc Tuy. Phuoc Tuy sat on South Vietnam's southern coast, roughly 70 kilometers southeast of Saigon. It was one of 11 provinces in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, stretching approximately 50 kilometers in length and 40 in depth, covering nearly 2,000 square kilometers of some of the most contested ground in all of South Vietnam. It was a place the South Vietnamese government had largely abandoned to the Viet Cong. 3/4 of the province was covered in rainforest and grassland, the kind of triple canopy jungle that swallowed sound and light in equal measure, where the humidity pressed against your chest like a wet hand, and visibility could drop to arm's length between one step and the next. Rubber plantations stretched in orderly rows that gave the illusion of civilization before dissolving into swamp and scrub at their edges. Rice paddies filled the lowlands, their still water reflecting a sky that could change from blazing sun to monsoon downpour in 20 minutes. The population numbered around 160,000, and the vast majority of them lived in villages where the Viet Cong had built political infrastructure reaching into every household, every market, every school. The province's authority barely extended beyond the capital of Baria, In the countryside, the Viet Cong collected taxes, administered justice, recruited fighters, and maintained an intelligence network that made conventional military operations feel like trying to fight smoke. The roads were death traps, passable only with heavy escorts. National Route 15, the main artery connecting Bien Hoa to the coastal port of Vung Tau, wound through mangrove swamps and ambush country that swallowed convoys and spit out wreckage. The mountains in the south, the Long Hai Range, rose from the coastal plains like the spine of some ancient creature, their limestone slopes honeycombed with caves and tunnel systems that had been expanded and fortified for over 2 decades. The Viet Cong had not simply dug into these mountains, they had become part of them. Underground rivers, limestone caverns, and interconnected passages created a subterranean world that no amount of aerial bombing could reach. The Americans had dropped over 40,000 tons of ordnance on the Long Hai slopes without dislodging the enemy. Military intelligence estimated roughly 5,000 communist troops operating in the province, including the feared D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, elements of the 274th and 275th Viet Cong regiments, and assorted local guerrilla units that could materialize from any village at any time and dissolve back into the population before a reaction force could be assembled. In short, Phuoc Tuy was a disaster, and that was precisely why the Australians wanted it. A province of manageable size, with access to the sea through Vung Tau for resupply, far enough from the Cambodian border to avoid the complications of cross-border enemy sanctuaries, and containing enough concentrated Viet Cong activity to provide a genuine test of Australian counterinsurgency methods. If the Australians could pacify Phuoc Tuy, they could prove their approach worked. If they failed, at least they would fail on their own terms, rather than as anonymous components of an American machine they did not trust. Lieutenant General John Wilton, the chairman of Australia's Joint Chiefs, had negotiated directly with General William Westmoreland to secure the arrangement. The deal was specific. The first Australian task force would be placed under the operational control of the American 2nd Field Force, a Corps-level headquarters at Bien Hoa, but it would be given its own tactical area of responsibility covering all of Phuoc Tuy Province. The Australians would answer to American Higher Command for coordination, but within their province they would fight their own war, using their own methods under their own commanders. This was not normal. No other Allied contingent in Vietnam had negotiated this level of independence. The South Koreans, the Thais, the Filipinos, all operated within the American framework to varying degrees. The Australians had essentially told the Americans, "Give us a province, leave us alone, and watch what happens." Brigadier Oliver David Jackson was chosen to command the task force. Jackson was not a man who had arrived at this moment by accident. He had fought in the Middle East and New Guinea during the Second World War, served in Korea, and commanded the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the small advisory unit that had been operating in-country since 1962. He knew Vietnam. He knew the enemy. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from watching the same mistakes repeated across multiple wars, that the American approach to counterinsurgency was producing the opposite of its intended effect. Jackson selected Nui Dat as the task force base, a small hill on Route 2 in the center of the province, approximately 30 kilometers from the logistics base at Vung Tau. The choice was deliberate and audacious. Nui Dat sat in the middle of Viet Cong territory, surrounded on every side by enemy-controlled terrain. The villages surrounding it, Long Tan and Long Phuoc were both considered enemy strongholds where Viet Cong cadre operated openly, and the local population provided food, intelligence, and recruits to the communist forces. Jackson, with the agreement of the Vietnamese province chief, had the inhabitants of both villages forcibly resettled, a decision that was controversial and that would compromise later efforts to win the hearts and minds of the provincial population, but that served his immediate and urgent purpose. It denied the Viet Cong observation of the base and prevented intelligence from flowing outward through the dense human networks that the enemy had cultivated for years. No Vietnamese civilians were permitted inside the perimeter. No ARVN personnel were allowed on base. No unauthorized vehicles, no vendors, no interpreters who had not been individually vetted. The Americans thought this was paranoid. The Australians thought it was common sense. At American bases throughout Vietnam, security was routinely compromised by Vietnamese workers, girlfriends, and visitors who provided a steady stream of intelligence to the Viet Cong. At Nui Dat, the enemy could probe the wire, could mortar the base from beyond the perimeter, could send reconnaissance teams to study patrol patterns from the surrounding jungle. But they could not see inside. They could not count heads. They could not identify which units were deployed and which remained at base. And that uncertainty was, in Jackson's calculation, worth more than any diplomatic goodwill that an open-door policy might have purchased. The Viet Cong noticed. Within weeks of the task force's arrival, they began probing the perimeter at night, sending teams to study the wire, to test the defensive positions, to map the fields of fire. They waved lights on poles to try to draw machine gun fire that would reveal gun positions. Jackson's orders were strict. No one fired unless they had a clear target at close range. The machine guns stayed silent. The Viet Cong were denied the information they needed to plan a ground assault, and the Australians spent those first weeks building Nui Dat into a fortification that even a divisional-strength attack would struggle to penetrate. Intelligence reports indicated that the 274th Regiment was planning to attack the base around mid-June to throw the Australians out of Phuoc Tuy and restore Viet Cong prestige among the local population. The attack never materialized in that form. When the Viet Cong did strike, it came in August, and it came in a way that no one had anticipated. The task force that Jackson assembled was small by American standards. 2 infantry battalions, the 5th and 6th Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, supported by a New Zealand artillery battery, engineers, signals, a troop of armored personnel carriers, and a detachment of the Special Air Service Regiment. Total strength was around 4,500 men. The Americans had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam by this point. The entire Australian contribution would barely have filled 1 American brigade. But Jackson was not interested in mass. He was interested in quality. And here is where the story becomes about something larger than one province or one war. It becomes about 2 fundamentally different philosophies of how to build a fighting force, and what happens when the weaker philosophy demands the stronger one accept its rejects. The Australian soldiers who arrived in Phuoc Tuy had been prepared through a training pipeline that bore almost no resemblance to what American replacements experienced. Every battalion destined for Vietnam cycled through the Jungle Training Center at Canungra in the hinterland of Queensland. Canungra had been established during the Second World War to prepare troops for the nightmare fighting in New Guinea, and it had been refined continuously through the Malayan Emergency, the Indonesian confrontation, and the early years of Vietnam. The instructors were veterans who had killed in jungles and nearly been killed in return. They were not theorists, they were survivors, and they taught survival. The training lasted weeks, and it was designed to break men who could not adapt and harden men who could. Companies were pushed through exercises that simulated the conditions of Vietnamese jungle warfare with punishing realism. Ambush drills, counter-ambush drills, night navigation, patrolling in silence, recognition of booby traps, casualty evacuation under fire, the management of fear during sustained operations in terrain where visibility dropped to 5 meters and death could come from any direction without warning. The men were assessed individually and collectively. Those who could not perform were removed. Those who remained were considered ready to fight in conditions that most armies on Earth were not trained to handle. This was not simply a matter of physical toughness, though Conungra demanded that in abundance. It was about producing soldiers who could think in the jungle, who could read the ground the way a farmer reads weather, who could detect the minute signs of human presence that the untrained eye would miss entirely. A bent twig, a disturbance in leaf litter, the absence of insect noise in a patch of forest where insects should be screaming. These were the skills that kept Australian patrols alive, and they could not be taught in a 6-week replacement pipeline. The Australian Army also drew on something that no other Western military possessed, a tradition of bush warfare extending back to the colonial frontier, refined through fighting in the Boer War, the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Borneo and Malaya, and carried forward by men who had grown up in rural Australia, where the landscape itself demanded a relationship with terrain that urban populations had long since abandoned. The SAS troopers who deployed with the task force were the sharpest expression of this tradition. They were selected through a process so demanding that fewer than 1 in 12 candidates survived it. They were trained for 18 months before deployment, 3 times longer than American Special Forces training of the same era, and a significant portion of their preparation took place in the Australian outback, learning tracking and observation techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods represented over 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge about moving through hostile wilderness without being detected. The result was a force that was small, but extraordinarily capable at the specific kind of warfare Phuoc Tuy demanded. Australian patrols moved through jungle in 5-man teams, communicating through touch signals so subtle that observers standing meters away could miss them entirely. They moved slowly, sometimes covering only 100 meters in an hour, stopping to listen, to smell, to read the jungle with senses that training had sharpened to levels most people could not comprehend. They wore sandals cut from tire rubber to disguise their tracks. They abandoned soap, deodorant, and commercial toothpaste weeks before patrol to eliminate the chemical scent signatures that the Viet Cong had learned to detect from hundreds of meters away. They modified their weapons, shortening the barrels of their L1A1 self-loading rifles to prevent snagging in dense undergrowth, sacrificing long-range accuracy that was meaningless in terrain where you could not see past 15 meters. These were not theoretical advantages. They were producing measurable results that American intelligence officers found difficult to process. The Australian SAS was achieving kill ratios that dwarfed anything American units could match in comparable operations. Enemy patrols routinely passed within meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting their presence. The Viet Cong, who had tracked French colonial forces for years, who tracked South Vietnamese and American patrols almost at will, could not track the Australians. Captured enemy documents would eventually reveal that the Viet Cong had developed entirely separate tactical guidance for engaging Australian forces. The recommended approach for Australians was avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because Australians were more likely to detect the trap than to walk into it. Do not attempt pursuit because their counter-tracking capabilities made such efforts pointless and potentially fatal. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The term carried supernatural connotations that no other Allied force had earned. This was the force that Brigadier Jackson had built, and the successive commanders after him maintained. This was the standard. And this was what was threatened when the Americans, in their endless hunger for bodies to fill the machine, began suggesting that American replacement troops be integrated into Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy. The suggestion came through multiple channels at various points during the war. The American military, by 1967 and 1968, was consuming soldiers at a rate that its training pipeline could barely sustain. The draft was pulling men from civilian life and rushing them through basic training and advanced individual training in a matter of months. These men were then shipped to Vietnam and assigned to units as individual replacements, often arriving in country knowing almost nothing about the specific conditions they would face. They did not know the terrain. They did not know the enemy's habits. They did not know the veterans in the units they were joining. They were, in the blunt assessment of many American officers themselves, warm bodies filling slots on an organizational chart. The numbers told a story of institutional dysfunction so enormous it was almost invisible. Between 1965 and 1972, the American military cycled over 2.7 million personnel through Vietnam. The individual rotation system meant that at any given time, a significant percentage of the soldiers in any American unit were newcomers still learning the environment, while another percentage were short-timers counting days until their rotation home, psychologically already out of the war. The middle portion, the men who knew what they were doing and were still engaged enough to do it well, was never as large as the organizational chart suggested, and the training these men received before deployment was increasingly disconnected from the reality they encountered on arrival. American basic training was designed to produce soldiers who could function in conventional warfare, who could march, shoot, follow orders, and operate as interchangeable parts in a large mechanized force. It was excellent at this purpose. It was not designed to produce men who could move silently through triple canopy jungle for days without speaking, who could read the signs of an approaching ambush in the behavior of birds, who could distinguish between the sound of wind moving through bamboo and the sound of a human body doing the same. These were skills that required specialized training, extended acclimatization, and the kind of institutional investment that the American rotation system made structurally impossible. The Australian Army had seen firsthand what happened when undertrained soldiers entered the jungle. During the early phase of their deployment, when the 1st Battalion had been attached to the American 173rd Airborne at Bien Hoa, Australian officers had watched American replacements arrive, receive minimal orientation, and be sent into the field within days. Some of these men were dead within a week, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked knowledge that only time and training could provide. They moved too quickly. They stepped in the wrong places. They failed to see the tripwires, the punji stakes hidden beneath leaves, the subtle disturbance in the trail surface that an experienced soldier would have recognized as the pressure plate of a command-detonated mine. Every one of these deaths was, in the Australian professional assessment, preventable, and everyone reinforced the Australian conviction that the individual replacement system was a machine for converting living men into casualties. The rotation system compounded the problem catastrophically. American soldiers served individual 12-month tours. This meant that experienced men were constantly cycling out and being replaced by newcomers who had to learn everything the departing soldiers knew, usually under fire, usually at the cost of lives that better preparation could have saved. Units never achieved the level of cohesion that comes from training together, deploying together, and fighting together over extended periods. There was no institutional memory at the small unit level. Every lesson learned had to be relearned by the next rotation of replacements. A platoon that had spent 3 months learning the patterns of the enemy in its sector would lose half its experienced men in a single week of rotations and have to start the learning process over again with men who did not even know the names of the trails they were patrolling. The Australians operated on a completely different model. Entire battalions trained together in Australia, deployed together to Vietnam, served their tour as a unit, and returned together. This meant that the soldiers in a platoon had spent months learning each other's habits, strengths, weaknesses, and instincts before they ever set foot in the jungle. The section commander knew which of his men could be trusted to stay silent under pressure and which needed a steadying hand. The platoon sergeant knew which soldiers had the patience for hours of observation and which were better suited to the violence of a close-range ambush. This cohesion was not an abstraction. It was a combat multiplier that could not be quantified on a spreadsheet, but was measured in the survival rate of every patrol that entered the jungle. When the American military suggested integrating its troops into Australian operations, it was proposing to inject men who had been trained to a different standard, prepared for a different kind of war, and accustomed to a different set of assumptions directly into a system that depended on every man understanding and executing a shared methodology that took months to develop. The Australian commanders who received these proposals understood immediately what it would mean. It would mean soldiers who move too fast and too loud, who crash through undergrowth that Australian troopers would part with their hands and release without a sound. Soldiers who carried the chemical scent signatures that the Viet Cong had learned to track, the residue of American soap and deodorant and insect repellent that hung in humid jungle air like a neon sign reading "Enemy Approaching." Soldiers who had been trained to call for firepower rather than rely on fieldcraft, whose first instinct under contact was to get on the radio and bring in artillery or airstrikes rather than to use the silence and the jungle itself as weapons. Soldiers whose instinct under contact was to shoot first and think second, rather than to observe, assess, and strike with the calculated precision that Australian doctrine demanded. It would mean patrols that were detected before they reached their objective. It would mean ambushes that failed because the enemy heard the approach. It would mean intelligence operations compromised by men who did not understand the difference between moving through the jungle and becoming part of it. And it would mean, in the most direct and non-negotiable terms possible, that Australian soldiers would die because their new American companions did not know how to survive in the kind of war being fought in Phuoc Tuy. Men who had spent months perfecting the art of invisibility would be rendered visible by the presence of one soldier who had never been taught that invisibility was possible. A 5-man patrol where 4 men moved in silence and 1 did not was not a 4/5 effective patrol. It was a compromised patrol, and a compromised patrol in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy was a dead patrol. The friction between Australian methods and American expectations was not limited to the replacement question. General William Westmoreland himself reportedly complained to Major General Tim Vincent, the commander of Australian forces in Vietnam, that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough. By American standards, this was true. The Australians were not producing the body counts that Westmoreland demanded. They were not launching the large-scale sweep and clear operations that characterized American doctrine. They were not consuming ammunition and ordnance at the industrial rates that American logistics had been designed to supply. They were instead conducting careful, intelligence-driven patrols, establishing ambushes along routes identified through patient observation, building relationships with the Vietnamese population in ways that denied the Viet Cong the support base they depended on, and slowly, methodically, grinding down the enemy's ability to operate in Phuoc Tuy. American commanders sometimes accused the Australians of avoiding contact to keep casualty figures low. This accusation enraged Australian officers who knew that their men were spending weeks in the jungle, living in conditions that American troops would not tolerate, hunting an enemy that had learned to fear them, and doing so with a fraction of the support that American units took for granted. The Australians were not avoiding contact. They were choosing contact on their terms, at times and places where their advantages were maximized and the enemy's were minimized. This was not cowardice. This was professional warfare of the highest order. The body count metric that the Americans used to measure success was held in open contempt by Australian battalion commanders. They understood what the Americans seemed unable to grasp, that the number of enemy killed was irrelevant if the enemy could replace its losses faster than you could inflict them. What mattered was not how many Viet Cong you killed, but how many villagers you convinced to stop supporting them. What mattered was not how much jungle you destroyed with napalm and defoliant, but how much of the province you could make genuinely secure. What mattered was not the dramatic helicopter assault or the thundering artillery barrage, but the quiet patrol that passed through a village without frightening the children or trampling the rice paddies, that left behind the impression of professional soldiers who could be trusted rather than feared. And yet even the Australians could not entirely escape the gravitational pull of the larger American war. When the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam on the 30th of January, 1968, the 1st Australian Task Force was ordered north to defend the vital Bien Hoa and Long Binh complex during Operation Coburg. For weeks, Australian battalions fought along infiltration routes leading to Saigon, engaging Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army Main Force units in a kind of warfare closer to the American model than anything they had practiced in Phuoc Tuy. The fighting was heavy. 17 Australians were killed and 61 wounded. Enemy casualties exceeded 145 killed, with over 100 wounded and several captured. It was brutal, conventional combat that stretched the task force thin and left Phuoc Tuy partially unguarded. Then came Coral and Balmoral. In May and June of 1968, Australian battalions were deployed to fire support bases astride enemy movement corridors northeast of Saigon. At Fire Support Base Coral, the Australians fought their largest and most dangerous battle of the war, when regular North Vietnamese Army forces attacked in battalion and regimental strength. It was near conventional warfare, the kind of grinding close-quarters combat that tested every skill and every nerve. The Australians held, but the experience reinforced a truth their commanders already knew. Every time the task force was pulled away from Phuoc Tuy for large-scale operations, the patient work of pacification suffered. The Viet Cong crept back into areas that had been secured. The village networks that had been disrupted began to regenerate. The progress of months could be lost in weeks. This was another reason the Australian commanders resisted American integration. Operating outside their province under American direction diluted the very qualities that made the task force effective. It put Australian soldiers into situations where their training advantages were partially neutralized by the demands of conventional defense, where mass mattered more than stealth, where holding ground replaced the mobile, intelligence-driven operations that were the foundation of their success. Every time it happened, the Australians returned to Phuoc Tuy, having lost time, men, and momentum that could not easily be recovered. This was the lesson of Malaya, where the British and Australians had defeated a communist insurgency not through firepower, but through population security and political warfare. This was the lesson of Borneo, where Australian SAS troopers had operated in tiny teams behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and disrupting Indonesian operations with a patience and precision that conventional forces could not replicate. And this was the lesson that Phuoc Tuy was proving every day, in the steadily expanding zone of government control, in the declining effectiveness of Viet Cong operations, in the intelligence flowing from villagers who had begun to trust that the Australians would protect them. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966 had demonstrated what Australian soldiers could do when the situation demanded conventional combat. On the afternoon of the 18th of August, 108 men of D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, accompanied by 3 New Zealand artillerymen, walked into a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat and collided with a combined Viet Cong force estimated at over 2,000 fighters. For nearly 4 hours, in torrential rain, under fire from automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades, D Company held its ground against odds exceeding 10 to 1. They did it through fire discipline, through the cohesion that came from having trained together as a unit, through the skill of their artillery forward observers who called in devastating fire from 3 batteries at Nui Dat, and through the sheer bloody-minded refusal to break that had been bred into them at Canungra and every training exercise before it. When armored personnel carriers carrying A Company finally broke through to relieve them at dusk, the Viet Cong withdrew, leaving 245 confirmed dead on the field. 18 Australians had been killed and 25 wounded. It was a price that shook the task force, but it was also proof, delivered in blood and rain and the roar of artillery, that Australian training produced soldiers who could survive and prevail in conditions that would have destroyed lesser units. Long Tan became the defining battle of the Australian War in Vietnam, not because it changed the strategic situation, but because it established the moral and psychological dominance of the task force over the enemy in Phuoc Tuy. The Viet Cong had attempted to overwhelm the Australians with their best troops and their heaviest weapons, and they had failed. The survivors carried that knowledge into every subsequent patrol, every ambush, every contact. They had faced the worst the enemy could deliver, and they had stood. This was the force that Australian commanders refused to dilute with American replacements, not because they hated Americans, not because they were arrogant, but because they understood, with the hard-won clarity of men who had buried their friends in foreign soil, that the quality of the soldiers standing beside you mattered more than the quantity. A 5-man patrol of Australian SAS troopers who had trained together for months and trusted each other completely was more dangerous to the enemy than a platoon of strangers who had met each other on a helicopter 2 days earlier. The American system was not designed to produce the kind of soldier the Australian system produced. This was not a failure of individual Americans, many of whom were brave, capable, and resourceful men who performed extraordinary feats under appalling conditions. The Medal of Honor citations from Vietnam are filled with accounts of American soldiers who demonstrated courage that defies comprehension, men who threw themselves on grenades, who charged machine gun positions, who carried wounded comrades through killing zones while their own blood soaked the earth. The raw material of the American military was superb. The system that processed that material was the problem. It was a failure of institutional design. The American military had built a system optimized for industrial-scale warfare, for the kind of conflict where mass mattered more than mastery, where logistical capacity was the decisive factor, where the solution to any problem was more of everything. More troops, more helicopters, more artillery, more bombs, more of everything, until the sheer weight of American resources crushed whatever stood in opposition. This system had won the Second World War. It had held Korea. It was the foundation of American military power and the guarantor of Western security in the Cold War. But it was catastrophically ill-suited to the kind of war being fought in the jungles of Vietnam, where the enemy was invisible, where firepower destroyed the very population you were trying to protect, where every technological advantage was neutralized by an opponent who had spent decades learning to fight without technology. The American Army itself was not blind to these problems. Senior officers who had studied counterinsurgency knew that the approach was flawed. Studies like the PROVN report, the Program for the Pacification and Long-Term Development of Vietnam, had argued that Westmoreland's war of attrition was not working and could not work because it ignored the real struggle taking place in South Vietnam's hamlets and villages. Individual American soldiers and small unit leaders discovered through bitter experience the same lessons the Australians had brought with them from Malaya and Borneo. But the institution resisted change with the immovable inertia of a bureaucracy that measured success in statistics designed to confirm its existing assumptions. The body count went up, so the war must be going well. The helicopter sorties increased, so the effort must be sufficient. The tonnage of bombs dropped exceeded the total dropped in all of the Second World War. So surely the enemy must be weakening. That the enemy was not weakening, that every measure of escalation was matched by equivalent communist escalation, that the population was being alienated rather than secured. These were truths that the institutional machinery was not structured to process. The Australians had built a system optimized for exactly this kind of war. Their army was too small for industrial-scale conflict. They could not afford to waste soldiers. They could not replace losses with a draft that pulled millions of men from civilian life. Every soldier was an investment that had to produce returns, and the training pipeline was designed to ensure that investment was not wasted. The scarcity of resources that Americans might have seen as weakness was, in the Australian context, a strength. It forced economy. It demanded efficiency. It required that every man who entered the jungle was as prepared as human training could make him. The result was a force that fought smarter because it could not afford to fight harder, that valued stealth because it could not afford firepower, that prioritized intelligence because it could not afford ignorance. The refusal to accept American replacements was, in the end, a statement about what kind of war the Australians believed they were fighting and what kind of soldiers that war required. It was a statement that training mattered more than numbers, that cohesion mattered more than individual capability, that understanding the enemy, the terrain, and the population mattered more than firepower, and that the measure of a military force was not how many soldiers it could deploy, but how effectively those soldiers could achieve the mission they had been given. Phuoc Tuy was never fully pacified. The Viet Cong were reduced but not eliminated, and when the Australians withdrew in late 1971, the enemy began moving back into the province almost immediately. The painstaking work of years began to unravel within months. The ARVN forces that replaced the Australians did not have the training, the cohesion, or the will to maintain what had been built. The villages that had cautiously aligned with the government hedged their bets once more. The Viet Cong infrastructure that had been suppressed regenerated like fungus after rain. By 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets of Saigon, Phuoc Tuy had long since returned to the enemy. The war was lost, not in Phuoc Tuy, but in the political capitals of Washington, Canberra, and Saigon, where the will to continue fighting evaporated under the pressure of domestic opposition and strategic failure. In Australia, the anti-war movement had gathered enormous momentum. By 1970 and 1971, hundreds of thousands of Australians were marching in moratorium protests across every major city. The conscription system that had provided many of the soldiers serving in Vietnam, the birthday ballot that selected 20-year-old men by lottery for 2 years of mandatory service, became a focal point of rage. Over 63,000 Australians had been conscripted during the war. More than 15,000 national servicemen served in Vietnam. Over 200 of them died. The government of William McMahon made the decision to withdraw, and when Gough Whitlam replaced him as Prime Minister in December 1972, one of his first acts was to abolish conscription entirely. The soldiers who came home from Phuoc Tuy returned to a country that did not want to hear what they had done or why they had done it. Vietnam veterans in Australia faced a reception that ranged from indifference to open hostility. Men who had served with extraordinary professionalism in one of the most demanding environments on earth found themselves treated as pariahs, lumped together with the broader political controversy of the war itself, rather than recognized as individuals who had answered a call that their government had issued. The psychological toll was immense. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually prove to be among the highest of any Allied contingent, a cruel irony for a force that had prioritized the survival of its members above all other metrics. The SAS troopers who had operated as phantoms in the jungle carried particular burdens. The skills that had made them invisible in Phuoc Tuy, the suppression of normal human impulses, the hypervigilance, the capacity to exist in states of pure sensory awareness for days at a time, did not switch off when the plane landed in Perth or Sydney. Men who had trained themselves to detect threats in every shadow, every movement, every sound, found civilian life unbearable in ways that clinical psychology struggled to explain. The emotional openness that relationships required was precisely what they had taught themselves to eliminate. The chaos and noise of ordinary life triggered responses designed for environments where chaos and noise meant death. Some adapted, many struggled. A few never found their way back to the world they had left. But within their province, for the years they held it, the Australians demonstrated something that the vast American military machine, with all its wealth and power and technology, could not match. They demonstrated that a small force, properly trained, properly led, and properly motivated, could achieve results that a large force fighting the wrong way could never approach. The Australian task force recorded at least 3,370 enemy killed during its time in Phuoc Tuy. Total Australian casualties during the entire Vietnam War were 521 killed and over 3,000 wounded across all services and all years. Nearly 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam over the course of the commitment. The SAS, that small detachment of phantoms who operated throughout Phuoc Tuy and beyond, conducted nearly 1,200 patrols during its 6 years in country. They killed at least 492 enemy fighters, with 106 more possibly killed, and captured 11 prisoners. Their own losses were staggering in their modesty. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. 580 men served in the SAS in Vietnam. Those numbers were not luck. They were not favorable terrain. They were the product of selection, training, doctrine, and leadership that refused to compromise its standards, even when the most powerful military in history was offering to help. The Australian commanders who said, "Don't send us your rejects," were not making a political statement. They were making a professional judgment based on the only metric that mattered in the jungle: survival. Their soldiers survived because they were trained to survive. Their patrols returned because they knew what they were doing. Their province was secured because they understood the war they were fighting, and they refused, absolutely and without apology, to let anyone compromise that understanding, no matter how many stars were on the shoulder asking them to accept it. In the end, the arithmetic spoke for itself, not in the grand strategic calculations of Washington and Hanoi, where millions of lives were weighed against political objectives that shifted with every election cycle, but in the small, brutal arithmetic of the jungle, where the question was simple and the answer was final. Would the men beside you know what to do when the shooting started? Would they move quietly enough to keep you alive? Would they hold their fire until the moment was right? Would they carry you out if you fell? The Australians answered those questions in the affirmative, every patrol, every ambush, every contact, for 6 years in Phuoc Tuy Province, and they answered them because their commanders had the courage to say what needed to be said, even when it offended the most powerful allies they had. Quality over quantity, training over numbers, standards over diplomacy. That was the legacy of the first Australian task force. Not a war won because the war was lost. Not a province permanently secured because nothing in Vietnam was permanent, but a demonstration written in the only language that warfare respects, that the right soldiers, fighting the right way, for the right reasons, could do things that all the money and all the helicopters and all the bombs in the American arsenal could not accomplish. The phantoms of Phuoc Tuy proved it, and they proved it on their own terms. There is a final detail worth noting, because it speaks to something that statistics and operational assessments cannot capture. After the war, when the classified reports were finally declassified and the veterans finally began to speak, a pattern emerged in the testimony of American soldiers who had served alongside or near Australian forces. Many of them spoke of the Australians not with rivalry or resentment, but with a kind of bewildered admiration. They had watched these men from a country most Americans could not find on a map do things in the jungle that seemed to belong to a different century of warfare, things that their own training had never prepared them to understand, let alone replicate. Some of those Americans went home and spent careers trying to incorporate what they had witnessed into the American military system. The reforms of the 1980s that produced Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, and the modern apparatus of American Special Operations drew heavily on principles that Australians had demonstrated in Vietnam. The emphasis on small unit autonomy, on operator judgment, on patience and stealth over mass and firepower, these were ideas that had been available for adoption in 1966 and had been rejected by an institution that preferred its own comfortable failures to someone else's uncomfortable successes. The Australian commander who stood in that briefing room and told a general of the United States Army that he did not want American replacements was not being diplomatic. He was being something more dangerous. He was being right. And in a war where being right rarely mattered because the institutions that made decisions were designed to filter out uncomfortable truths, his stand preserved something valuable. It preserved the integrity of a small force that knew what it was doing in a conflict where knowing what you were doing was the rarest and most precious commodity of all. The men of the 1st Australian Task Force are old now, those who survive. The rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy have grown over the scars of war. Nui Dat is quiet. The long high mountains keep their secrets. But the question that was answered in those jungles remains relevant in every conflict that follows. Is it better to fight with many soldiers who are unprepared, or few soldiers who are ready? The Australians answered that question with everything they had, in a province most of the world has forgotten, in a war that most of the world would rather not remember. Their answer was unambiguous. It cost them friends, and years, and pieces of themselves they would never recover. But it was the right answer, and the jungle, which rewards only what works and punishes everything else, confirmed it every single day they were there.